Okay, hello everyone. Professor Todd Giles for AR105. And we're going to move on into the late Gothic in Italy. Now, this is distinctly different than the late Gothic up in France and Germany and Britain, where they were building these grand Gothic cathedrals, what we call them now. That really is the north. And the book talks a little bit about Vasari, the first art historian, coming up with that word or that thinking of Gothic being northern because it was um, sort of anathema to have that type of artwork. The Italians did not like that style, and very few pieces in Italy proper show that style and that flamboyancy. About the only most important Gothic piece that we have in Italy is in Milan, and that's in the far north. So it's more connected with France and Germany than it is with Rome or Florence. But as we move ahead here, I do want to step backwards a little bit into the section that we were just doing about Gothic and talk about this piece, the Rotgen Pietà. Um, the book does mention it, talks a little bit about it, which is nice, but I want you really to see the structure, what decisions the artist made here. I've said it before that these artists are not stupid. They know what they're doing, they're skilled. Just because this looks grotesque doesn't mean that it wasn't thought about. So as you look at it, look at the details. Look at the wounds in Christ's hands, his feet, his side, the thorns. And you can see the blood running down his arm, except look, it's running up because his hands were above his shoulders as he was on the cross. The artist had to think about that. From this wound, it goes up his arm, and then there's the blood drop dried. One thing to look at this, what I want you to see is that pose, okay? Where we have Mary, and we'll see here in just a second that very much during this time period, and before in the Byzantine even, we saw Mary with the child Christ on her lap, with her head tilted, touching him, presenting him to us. And now we see the exact same thing, except it's changed. We see Mary, the mother of Christ, with Christ on her lap, except now he's dead. Now he's been slaughtered. Now he's given his life for the people. And we see that grotesqueness of his sacrifice and how horrible it was, how bloody it was. Okay? This is very German. The Italians would be repelled by this. Again, it goes in with that word Gothic, that it's a derogatory term for the style of the North, the Germans and the French. So, but I want you to put this in your memory bank. Remember it, because we will see something very similar coming up that ties directly back to this style. And we'll talk about that more then. All right, now let's go back to late Gothic. And we'll go through the late Gothic, then I think we'll be able to get into a little bit of early Renaissance and then move on to another lecture to complete the late Renaissance. So, thing to look at here, one of the main types of artwork will be altarpieces. These are devotional representations of saints, usually Mary, usually Christ, in certain poses. They're either portable or they're standalone, and these would be used for devotion, to pray with, to help the believer pray to God using this, not as a portal or anything, but just as a representation of what God was like and make a connection. So the quatrefoil, which are the four circles interconnected, and we start to see shading and realism come in, and chiaroscuro, Italian for light and dark. So you have this contrast and play between light and dark, where the artists are actually trying to show realism by showing shading, by showing a surface that moves away and around, that actually shows the surface texture and it shows the surface shape by showing the shading. And it talks about where the lighting is coming from. So we see a little bit of drama being built. So let's get into it. One thing that we start to see is, I'm calling it iconography, but it's gestural poses that are the same. And here we see three representations of Mary holding the baby Christ. And look at the similarities. She has a hand up presenting Christ to us in some fashion, or touching him. She's wearing blue. Her head is covered. Okay, this is all very much of the culture of the time, more of Middle Ages as we're heading into towards the Renaissance. But this type of clothing would not be foreign to the people of this time in Europe. She's bowing her head just a little bit. She's looking at us or maybe a little bit off, but usually there is a connection looking at the viewer. Sometimes she has stars on her shoulders and are on her forehead, here on her robe. Usually she is sitting on some sort of chair that we'll call a throne. Okay? And then the baby Christ many times is holding up his hand, giving a blessing. This guy isn't. Here he is giving a blessing. And sometimes you can tell by how many fingers he has up, or whether his thumb is up also, on whether it's an Italian piece or a French piece, okay, or even Russian. Okay, so there are similarities here between the different cultures. So here's an altarpiece by one of the very first great artists, Cimabue. Okay, he is trying to show realism, but he's still in a style that looks very much like Byzantine. But look what he's doing here. He has a lot more realism. He knows about symmetry, person, 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 angel, 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 angel. So we see left and right is exactly the same with minor detail changes here and there. But what is different? Jesus is offset. So in the symmetry of this piece, he becomes the most important thing because he's not like anything else. Sort of the Sesame Street old thing of one of these things is not like the other. If it's not like the other, then it becomes important, something to be noticed. And you'll notice even down to the faces on these angels are exact mirror images of each other. Okay, one thing to look at is the folds here on the fabric. It's a good attempt at creating that feel of weight of fabric and what the texture of the fabric is, but still it is somewhat flat. Where is her knee under there? Where is her knee here? Okay, this foot is down. Is her knee here because the foot is down? More than likely. And Christ's foot is on her thigh. Okay, so he is trying to work with space, but it still is somewhat flat. And he's working with shading a little bit here so that we can see the shade underneath the jaw of the angels and Mary, but it's still very stylized. Okay. Okay, here's another Cimabue. This is a crucifix. And notice he is exploring lighting and shading, but again, very stylized. That is not a real stomach, especially of a crucified man. Christ on the cross here, he is dead, but where are the nails? There's only just a little bit of blood, and that's a whole different discussion on why there's not a lot of blood during this time. on the artwork. But Cimabue, okay, simplified forms, very stylized. And then let's move on to Cimabue's student, Giotto. Okay, Giotto really tries to move forward with space, with reality. Here's the Cimabue that we saw earlier, and it has overlapping angels, but look at these overlapping angels. That halo is right in front of the other one's face behind it. So it gives our eye and our mind an idea that, oh, that moves back into space. Instead of them being stacked up, they're all together, almost like they're standing on the same surface. Okay? And then we have Mary and the infant Christ here, sitting down on this, we'll call it a throne. Look at the fabric. The lighting is much more realistic off the surface of those folds compared to Giotto. Her face, even though this isn't the most glorious looking face here, he is playing with light and dark and shading, that she looks a bit more realistic versus the stylized Mary over here by Cimabue. So very much trying to get into something real. And if you look at the Christ child, he actually looks like he's heavy, that there's weight to him underneath his clothing. Okay, so, and real quick here, look how big these things are. Here's the one we just saw, over 11 feet tall. When I was in art history in college, I thought these were just small, like maybe this size. But compare that with these tourists here at the museum and with this Duccio piece, altar piece also, they're just huge. So these are for larger spaces, a lot of time and effort going into it, figuring out the design and how to move the art forward. Now, the last couple of minutes here, let's talk about the Scrovini Chapel. Here's the outside, also called the Arena Chapel because right over here in Padua was the arena for the Roman Empire. Okay, so this was built by a rich family, the Scrovini family, whose patriarch made scads of money basically hurting people. He's a merchant, but he took advantage of people. And the family, because the patriarch was so bad, they had to pay back God, per se, to try to get their father out of purgatory. The whole story of indulgences that, according to the Catholic dogma at the time, that the Pope could give an indulgence and get someone out of purgatory quicker by a few thousand years so that they could go to heaven. This is what this structure is about. It's a devotional structure dedicated to the life of Christ in the artwork here, the life of Mary on this lower level, and then up above are the ancestors of Christ. Now, it's a barrel vault, and Giotto was the one who designed this. Now, one thing about the barrel vault, the blue here is lapis lazuli, and at that time, and really today, the only place to get it is Afghanistan. So they did have trade with Afghanistan, but this blue was more expensive than gold. So they could have covered this whole structure with gold and still not paid what they did to have this lapis blue painted on the ceiling. Okay. One of the pieces that we see here is the Lamentation. So this is a fresco by Giotto. And later we'll find out more about fresco when we talk about Michelangelo. But we see Christ off the cross, Mary holding on to him, the other followers, and it's all about emotion. And that's one of the great things that Giotto brings back into the art world is realism, but realistic seeming reality of mourning, of happiness, of emotion. And we'll see much more of this, but this is really the great step forward towards reality again.